Need to check the used names list and then write the story. The names to avoid: Walter Hammond, Earl, Caroline, Richard, Thomas Bennett, Margaret, Daniel, Linda, Victor, Nora, Connor, Paulette, Claire, Nathan, Diane, Franklin, June, Kevin, Ashley, Sylvia, Patrick, Gregory, Harold, Calloway, Beverly, Rachel, Garrett, Owen, Marcus, Serena, Stan, Brooke, Damon, Renata, Arthur, Elaine, Cole, Lily, Douglas, Megan, Brett, Ted. New names I'll use: Raymond, narrator, 58, Vivian, ex-fiancée, Mom equals just my mother, Sandra, new love interest, Hal, Raymond's friend, new love interest, Hal, Raymond's friend, swedge witness. Judge, unnamed. I'll write now. 5,000 words, first person, American voice, memoir style. I cancelled the engagement at my own retirement party. In front of 63 people I had known for most of my adult life, I stood up from my seat at the head of the table, looked at the woman I had planned to marry, and said, "We're done." Then I sat back down and finished my chicken. That's the short version. The long version starts with my mother's hands. She had the hands of a woman who had worked every single day of her life, rough at the knuckles, soft the palm, stained permanently around the cuticles from the blackberries she picked every August from the bushes that ran along the back fence of our property in Harlan County, Kentucky. She never apologized for those hands, never tried to hide them. When I was 7 years old, she grabbed one of mine at a school fundraiser dinner when some woman in a silk blouse looked at her like she didn't belong. And my mother squeezed my hand once, firm, steady, and kept right on eating her dinner like the woman in silk didn't exist. That's the woman who raised me. My father died when I was 11. Heart attack in the cab of his pickup truck, halfway between our house and the grain co-op. My mother had $300 in the checking account and 2 boys to raise. She took in ironing. She cleaned the houses of 3 families in town on weekends. She grew what she could in the garden and canned it. She drove a school bus for 17 years. She never once asked anyone for anything she hadn't earned. When I left for college at 18 on a partial scholarship and 2 part-time jobs, she drove me to the bus station in Harlan in that same pickup truck my father had died in. She'd had the engine rebuilt, kept everything else original, and she hugged me for a long time at the curb. She didn't cry until she thought I was already on the bus. I wasn't. I was watching through the window. I carried that image for 40 years. I still carry it. I spent my career as a civil engineer with the County Road Department in Lexington. 40 years, same department. Worked my way from junior surveyor to deputy director. It wasn't glamorous. It was steady, honest work, the kind my mother understood. I bought a small house on the east side of Lexington, put money in my 401k every paycheck, paid off the mortgage in 22 years. I wasn't rich. I was comfortable. There's a difference, and I always knew which one I was. I met Vivienne at a charity auction 2 years before I retired. She was 44 to my 56. A fundraising consultant who worked with hospital foundations and arts organizations. She was polished in a way I wasn't used to. Good clothes, good posture, the kind of ease in a room that takes either money or relentless practice to develop. I assumed it was practice. I found out later it was money, old money, her grandfather's, most of which her family had gone through by the time she was in her 30s. She never mentioned that part. She laughed at my jokes. She asked real questions when I talked about work. She came to Lexington to see me 3 weekends in a row after we met, which I took as a serious sign because she lived in Cincinnati. We dated for 14 months. She was attentive, warm, smart. She had opinions about things. I liked that. When I proposed, she said yes before I finished the sentence. My mother drove up from Harlan for Sunday dinner 3 weeks after that. She was 79 years old, still living alone in the same house, still driving herself to church and the grocery store, still putting up blackberry preserves every August. Her hands were the same hands I remembered. Her back was a little more curved. She moved slower, but when she walked into my kitchen and smelled the pot roast I had in the oven, she closed her eyes and smiled the same way she always had, and I felt 11 years old again in the best possible sense. Vivienne arrived 40 minutes late. She had driven up from Cincinnati that morning and hit traffic, which happened. What didn't need to happen was the way she walked in, looked around my kitchen at the dishes my mother had helped me set out, nothing fancy, just the good plates I used for company, and said, "Oh, you're already set up," in a tone that landed somewhere between disappointed and unimpressed. My mother didn't react. She introduced herself and offered her hand. Vivienne shook it briefly, the way you shake a hand when you're already thinking about something else. I watched that. I told myself it was the traffic, the drive. She was tired and stressed. I told myself that a lot over the next several months. I got very good at telling myself things. Dinner was awkward. Vivienne talked mostly about the hospital gala she was planning in Cincinnati, the venue negotiations, the catering difficulties, a board member who kept overstepping. She talked about it for probably 40 minutes. My mother ate her pot roast and listened and asked polite questions. I asked polite questions. Vivienne did not ask my mother anything. Not one thing. Not one thing. Where she was from, or how the drive up from Harlan had been, or what she had been up to. My mother had driven 2.5 hours to have Sunday dinner with the woman her son was going to marry, and that woman spoke to her exactly twice during the entire meal, once to ask her to pass the salt, and once to agree that yes, the pot roast was very good. After my mother left that evening, she hugged me for a long time at the door, the way she always had, and then she drove 2.5 hours back to Harlan alone. I stood in my kitchen washing dishes, and I had a feeling I couldn't quite name. Not quite anger, not quite worry, something quieter and harder to place, like a small crack in a foundation that you notice and then walk away from and tell yourself is probably nothing. I walked away from it. I told myself it was probably nothing. My retirement party was my friend Hal's idea. Hal had worked in the county assessor's office for 30 years. We'd had lunch together almost every Tuesday for 20 of those years. He was the kind of man who remembered your birthday and your mother's name and what you'd said in passing 6 months ago. The kind of man you didn't realize was rare until you'd known him long enough to notice how few people like him there were. Hal booked the private room at a steakhouse downtown. 63 people showed up. Colleagues past and present, a few neighbors, my brother who drove up from Tennessee, and my mother, who I had arranged to stay with me for the weekend. She wore the blue dress she kept for special occasions. She'd had her hair done. She looked wonderful, and I told her so, and she waved me off the way she always did. Vivienne flew in from Cincinnati that afternoon. She'd had a work event the night before and couldn't come earlier. That was fine. I understood. What I did not understand, and did not expect, and have never fully made peace with, was what happened in the first 20 minutes of that party. My mother was seated next to Hal's wife, who was warm and easy to talk to, and the two of them were getting along well. I was making my way around the room, saying hello to people I hadn't seen in years, in some cases, feeling the particular bittersweet weight of an ending that is also a beginning. Vivienne was standing near the bar with a glass of wine when I came over to her. She was looking across the room at my mother. "She came all the way up here," she said. "Of course she did," I said. "It's my retirement party. Raymond." She said my name in a particular way, patient, like she was explaining something to someone who needed it explained. "Did you think about what it's going to look like? She's going to need attention all night. Someone's going to have to manage her." I looked at my mother, who was laughing at something Hal's wife had said, perfectly fine, managing herself beautifully. "She doesn't need to be managed," I said. "She's my mother." Vivienne took a small sip of her wine. "I just think you should have mentioned she was coming. I would have made different arrangements." "Different arrangements," I repeated. "Seating, logistics. I'm essentially co-hosting tonight, and I wasn't prepared. She's my mother," I said again. I wasn't sure what else to say. Vivienne moved on. She worked the room well. She always did. It was professionally useful to her, and I watched her, and I watched my mother, and somewhere in that watching the crack in the foundation that I had been walking away from for 14 months got a little wider. It was around the time the main courses arrived that it happened. My mother had gotten up to find the restroom. On her way back, she passed the end of the table where Vivienne was sitting with 3 of my former colleagues and their spouses. I don't know exactly what the conversation was. I was at the other end of the table. What I know is what happened next because Hal saw it and later told me, and because I heard part of it myself. My mother had stopped near Vivienne's end of the table to say something to one of the colleagues she'd met earlier in the evening, and Vivienne, without lowering her voice sufficiently, leaned toward the woman next to her and said, "She dresses like she's going to a church social in 1987. I tried to tell Raymond, but he never listens when it comes to her." The woman next to Vivienne said nothing. The colleague my mother had been speaking to looked away. My mother heard it. I know she heard it because she stopped mid-sentence, and there was a pause of about 2 seconds before she finished what she was saying, very quietly, and then made her way back to her seat. And when she sat down, she was very composed, and she picked up her fork and she continued eating, and she did not look at me, because she didn't want me to see her face. That's how I knew. My mother had not let anyone see her cry since my father's funeral. She was not going to start at a steakhouse in Lexington. Hal appeared at my shoulder about 4 minutes later. He leaned down and said very quietly, "Hey, you need to know something." He told me what he'd seen, what he'd heard. I put my fork down. I want to be careful here about how I describe the next several minutes, because I've replayed them many times and I don't want to make them into something more dramatic than they were. There was no scene. I didn't raise my voice. What I did was this. I sat still for about 30 seconds. Then I stood up, and I tapped my water glass. And when the table got quiet, I said that I wanted to thank everyone for coming, that it meant more than I could say, that I was proud of the work I'd done and the people I'd worked with, and that I was lucky to have spent my career among them. And then I looked at Vivienne and I said very evenly, "I'm going to need the ring back." The room went completely silent. Vivienne stared at me. "I'm sorry?" she said. "The engagement ring," I said. "I'd like it back, please." "Tonight." "Raymond, what you said about my mother," I said. "I heard it. Hal heard it. I think a few other people heard it too." I paused. "She drove 2 hours to be here tonight. She put on her good dress. And you talked about her like she was a problem to be managed." "I didn't," Vivienne began. "I'm not going to argue about it," I said. "Not here, not in front of these people. But I need you to understand something." I looked at her steadily. "That woman right there has worked harder than anyone in this room. She raised 2 boys alone on a school bus driver's salary. She never complained about it once. She never asked anyone for a single thing she hadn't earned. And she came up here tonight because she loves me. That's all. That's the whole reason." I picked up my water glass. "So I'd like the ring back," I said. "Please." There is a particular silence that happens when 60-some people are in a room and every single one of them stops breathing at the same time. That was the silence that happened. Vivienne's face went through several things in quick succession. She reached up, removed the ring from her finger. It took a moment. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she set it on the table. Then she picked up her purse, stood up, and walked out. Her heels were very loud on the floor of the private room. Nobody moved for about 5 seconds. Then Hal started clapping. I don't know why, but he started clapping, and the room kind of exhaled, and then a few other people clapped, and then I walked down to the end of the table and sat down next to my mother. She was looking at her plate. When I sat down, she looked up at me, and her eyes were bright but dry, because she was my mother, and she did not cry in public. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did," I said. She pressed her lips together. Then she picked up her fork. "The steak is very good," she said. "It is," I said, and we finished dinner. I want to tell you that the next morning was quiet and simple. It wasn't, but the hard parts weren't what I expected. Vivienne called at 7 a.m., then at 7:15, then at 8. I let the first 2 go to voicemail and answered the third, because I've never been someone who avoids necessary things for very long. The conversation was long and difficult, and I'll compress it here because most of it wasn't new information. She was angry, then hurt, then angry again. She said I had humiliated her in front of my colleagues. I said she had humiliated my mother in front of my colleagues, and that one of those things had happened first. She said I was choosing my mother over a future with her. I said that if those two things were in conflict, that was information I needed to have. At some point in that conversation, she said something that clarified everything. She said, "Raymond, I was always willing to tolerate your mother. I just needed her to stay in her lane." Tolerate. Stay in her lane. I appreciate your honesty, I said, and I meant it, genuinely. Because clarity, however late, is still clarity. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long while with a cup of coffee. My mother was still asleep in the guest room. I could hear the house settling around me the way old houses do in the morning. The refrigerator hum, the furnace kicking on. Ordinary sounds that I had stopped really hearing years ago. I thought about what the house looked like when I bought it. I thought about the mortgage payment I had made every month for 22 years. I thought about the retirement party Hal had organized for me, and the colleagues who had come, and the look on my mother's face when she had heard what Vivienne said. I thought about the word tolerate, and what it meant that someone who claimed to love me had chosen it. What came next I did not plan. It came out of a conversation I had entirely by accident about 3 weeks after the party with my accountant during our annual tax meeting. It was routine. I'd been working with the same firm for 20 years. My accountant, a methodical man who communicated mostly in quiet understatement, was going through the year's numbers, and at the end he looked up and said, "You're going to want to think about your beneficiary designations now that your circumstances have changed. And also," he paused, in the way he paused when something required particular attention, "I noticed you haven't done anything yet with the property transfer from your mother." I looked at him. "What property transfer?" I said. He told me, "I will give you a moment to understand what I understood sitting in that chair." My mother, at some point in the previous year, working quietly through a real estate attorney in Harlan whose name I had never heard, had transferred into a trust with my name as sole beneficiary. The farmland, not the house she lived in, the land attached to it and the parcels adjacent to it that she had, over the course of 40 years, quietly acquired in small increments as neighbors sold off portions they no longer wanted to work, because the land in Harlan County had been in her family for 2 generations before my father's family added to it, and because she had bought the additional parcels over decades for what they cost in the 1980s and 1990s. She had never talked about any of it in terms of value. She talked about it in terms of what it produced, and what it cost to maintain, and whether the fence line on the north side needed attention. The total acreage was 263 acres. At current Harlan County land values, which had risen considerably as energy and timber interests had moved back into the area, the accountant showed me the appraisal. 263 acres, appraised at just under $2 million. My mother had been driving a 2009 Buick and clipping grocery coupons, and she owned nearly $2 million in land, which she had apparently decided, without telling me, without making any production of it whatsoever, to put in my name. I drove to Harlan that weekend. I sat across from her at the kitchen table where I had done homework as a child, and I put the appraisal document on the table between us, and I said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" She looked at the paper. She looked at me. "What was there to tell?" she said. "It was always going to be yours. I just made it official. Mom, it's almost $2 million. She waved her hand in a gesture I had seen 1,000 times. The gesture meant, "You're making too much of this." "It's land," she said. "It doesn't do anything sitting there. You'll figure out what to do with it." I didn't know what to say. I sat there for probably a full minute without saying anything. "Raymond," she said in the voice she had used when I was 15 and she wanted me to pay attention, "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you making decisions based on it, getting into relationships based on it. I wanted you to just live your life." She paused. "I think you did okay." I thought about Vivienne. I thought about the word tolerate. I thought about what Vivienne's interest in our relationship might have looked like if she had known that the quiet, inconvenient woman in the blue church dress owned 263 acres of Kentucky land. I was glad in that moment that my mother had not told me. I was glad I had not known, because it meant that everything that had happened clean. My mother reached across the table and patted my hand twice, the way she had my whole life. Then she got up to put the kettle on. "Stay for dinner," she said. I made soup. I stayed for dinner. Over the next several months, I did a lot of thinking about what to do with the land. Some of it I decided to keep, particularly the parcel that contained the original farmhouse site where my grandmother had been raised, which felt like something that shouldn't be sold. For the rest, after consulting with a land use attorney and a financial planner, I worked out a plan that allowed some of the acreage to be leased to a regional agricultural cooperative, and some to be conserved through a land trust program, which came with both tax advantages and the satisfaction of knowing the land would stay land. The process took the better part of a year. During that year, I retired properly, meaning I stopped going to the office, fixed up the house in Lexington, drove down to Harlan every 6 weeks or so to spend weekends with my mother, and did a lot of the nothing that I had not had time to do for 4 decades. I read books. I fixed the fence on the east side of my backyard that I had been meaning to fix for 3 years. I had long Tuesday lunches with Hal and his wife. I was not looking for anyone. I was very specifically not looking. Sandra came to my attention because of a bird. I was at the Botanical Garden in Lexington on a weekday morning in September, which is one of the things retirement makes possible, walking around the pond area with a cup of coffee, when I noticed a woman crouched near the water's edge with a pair of binoculars, trained on a particular spot in the cattails. She was around my age. I would find out later she was 54, and she was completely absorbed in whatever the binoculars were showing her. I walked over because I was curious, and because I had nowhere to be, and because when you are 58 years old and retired, you can walk over to things that interest you without worrying about whether it's the right moment. "What are you looking at?" I said. She held up one finger, wait, and kept watching. Then she lowered the binoculars and said, without turning around, "Virginia rail. They're almost never out in the open like this." I had no idea what a Virginia rail was. I said so. She turned around then, and she was smiling at her own absorption in the thing, the slightly self-aware smile of someone who knows they've just been enthusiastically strange in front of a stranger. "It's a secretive marsh bird," she said. "They're here, but you almost never see them. This one's just standing there like it doesn't care." We both looked at the cattails for a moment. "Good for it," I said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, uncalculated, the kind that comes out before you decide to let it. Her name was Sandra. She was a retired high school biology teacher. She had grown up in eastern Kentucky, about 40 miles from where I had grown up, and had spent her career in Lexington, and she knew the difference between a Virginia rail and a common gallinule, which is more than I knew but less than she had hoped everyone knew. She was warm and direct, and she talked about things she cared about, with the ease of someone who had long since stopped worrying about whether caring about things was impressive. We walked around the pond for 2 hours that morning. Then we had coffee at the garden cafe. Then I drove home and found I was still thinking about the conversation. I called Hal. I told him I had met a woman at the Botanical Garden who was watching birds. "Good," he said. "I'm not sure about any of this," I said. "Raymond," he said, "you cancelled your engagement at your own retirement party because a woman talked about your mother like she was an inconvenience. That is not a man who makes bad decisions. Call the bird woman." I called the bird woman. We had dinner the following Friday at a restaurant on the east side that neither of us had tried. We talked for 3 hours and didn't notice the time until the waiter came to reset the table around us. She had a daughter in Nashville and a son in college in Ohio. She had spent summers growing up helping her grandfather tend his vegetable garden, and she still grew tomatoes every year on her back porch, which she said was an inadequate substitute, but the best she could manage. She asked about my family. I told her about my mother in Harlan. I told her about the pickup truck and the bus driving and the canning and the hands. She listened the way people listen when they're not thinking about what they're going to say next. "She sounds like someone worth knowing," Sandra said. "She's the best person I know," I said, "by some distance." Sandra nodded like that was not a complicated thing to say, like it was simply a fact about a person that you could state plainly. It was, I realized, the first time I had said that about my mother to someone I was having dinner with, and had it received as just a normal, complete thing. We had dinner again the following week. And the week after that, it was unhurried, which suited me. I was not in a hurry anymore. I had learned some things about being in a hurry. In April, about 7 months after we met at the pond, I brought Sandra to Harlan to meet my mother. My mother made pot roast, not because I asked her to. I hadn't said anything about food, but because that's what she made when people came to dinner. When Sandra walked in, she looked at the kitchen, at the jars of preserves lined up on the counter, at the old table where my mother had fed me breakfast before school for 11 years, and she said, "Oh, this kitchen smells wonderful." My mother turned around from the stove. She looked at Sandra for a moment. "You're from Eastern Kentucky," she said. Sandra looked surprised. "How'd you know that?" "The way you said wonderful," my mother said. "Sit down. Dinner's almost ready." They talked through the entire meal. They talked about gardens and the difference between clay and loam, and whether raised beds were worth the trouble. They talked about the changes in Harlan County over the decades, the economic shifts, what had stayed and what hadn't. They talked about teaching and what it was like to pour yourself into a classroom of teenagers for 30 years and whether it had been worth it. And they both agreed, independently but simultaneously, that yes, it had been. After dinner, my mother brought out the blackberry preserves. She set them on the table with a spoon for tasting, which is not something she did for everyone. I sat at that table in the kitchen where my mother had fed me my whole childhood and watched the two of them talk and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not excitement, not relief, something quieter than either of those things. Something that felt like the right answer to a question I had been working on for a while. I'm not going to tell you it was all simple from there, because life isn't. My mother's health became more of a concern the following year, and we navigated that with the help of a home health aide 3 days a week, and my regular visits, and my brother came up more frequently from Tennessee. The land trust arrangements took longer to finalize than expected. There were forms and legal reviews and a surveyor's dispute about one of the boundary lines that took 6 months to resolve. But the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I find myself telling people when they ask, and people do ask, because Hal tells the story at dinner parties, and he is not a subtle man, is not the drama of that party, or the ring, or the silence in the room. The thing I keep coming back to is my mother, sitting across from Sandra at that kitchen table, pushing the blackberry preserves across to her and saying, without preamble, "Tell me about these tomatoes you're growing. What variety?" And Sandra saying, with complete seriousness, "Cherokee Purple, do you know them?" And my mother's face opening up. "Best tomato there is," she said. That's the whole story. That's all of it. A woman worked her whole life in a county most people have never heard of, raised 2 boys on almost nothing, never made a production of any of it, and quietly accumulated something worth knowing. Not the land, though she did that too. What I mean is, she accumulated a way of being in the world, steady, honest, decent, without pretense, and she passed it down to me, and I made a decision at a party based on it, and the decision was right. I'm 59 years old now. I have lunch with Hal on Tuesdays. I drive down to Harlan every 5 or 6 weeks. Sandra and I made plans to put in a raised bed together this spring because she finally agreed that raised beds are worth the trouble, and I suspect she was right all along and simply wanted to see if I'd do the work. The Virginia rail was still in the cattails the last time we went back to the botanical garden. At least Sandra said it was. I'll take her word for it. She knows more about that than I do. I find I'm at peace with that. My mother, for her part, has a jar of Cherokee Purple seeds in her kitchen window that Sandra mailed to her in February. She sent back a jar of blackberry preserves. No note. None needed. None needed. That's the woman who raised me. And I am grateful, every day, that I knew it. I've had a lot of time to think about all of it. Retirement gives you that more quiet than you expect, more space to turn things over. What I keep coming back to isn't the moment I asked for the ring back. It isn't the silence in that room or the sound of Vivienne's heels on the floor. What I keep coming back to is something much smaller. It's my mother at the kitchen table in Harlan, sliding a jar of blackberry preserves across to Sandra and asking about Cherokee Purple tomatoes like it was the most natural conversation in the world. Because it was. That's the thing. That's the whole point. Vivienne looked at my mother and saw an inconvenience. A woman in an outdated dress who needed to be managed, who should stay in her lane. What she missed, what her particular kind of blindness would not allow her to see, was that my mother had been building something her entire life. Not loudly, not for recognition. 263 acres, bought slowly, quietly, parcel by parcel, across 4 decades, because she understood that honest work compounds, that patience compounds, that a life lived with integrity doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates. There's a kind of intelligence that never shows up on a resume or a social calendar. It's the intelligence of knowing what actually matters, and then doing it day after day without requiring anyone to notice. My mother had that in abundance. She had it when she took in ironing after my father died. She had it when she drove a school bus for 17 years and still found time to put up preserves every August. She had it when she transferred that land into my name without a word, because she didn't want the knowledge of it to corrupt anything. She wanted me to live clean. I think about that decision a lot. She could have told me years ago. It might have changed things, the way I moved through the world, the relationships I entered, what I thought I needed. She chose not to, and that choice protected me in ways I didn't understand until I was sitting in my accountant's office staring at an appraisal document with my mouth open. The consequence of Vivienne's contempt was not punishment in any dramatic sense. It was simply accuracy. She saw the situation incorrectly. She acted on that incorrect seeing, and reality corrected her. That's how it tends to work. Contempt is expensive. It costs you exactly what you are contemptuous of, and usually more. What I know now at 59 that I did not fully know before any of this happened is that the way a person treats someone they believe to be beneath them tells you everything. Not some things, everything. It tells you about their intelligence, whether they can see past surface to substance. It tells you about their character, whether they extend basic decency regardless of perceived status. And it tells you about their resilience, whether they've built themselves on something real or only on the approval of people they consider worth impressing. My mother built herself on something real. 79 years old, rough hands, a 2009 Buick, a jar of Cherokee purple seeds on her windowsill. She is the strongest person I have ever known, and I did not fully understand that until I watched someone try to diminish her and fail completely. I'm glad I stood up at that party. I'm glad I said what I said, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest, and honesty, even when it costs you something, has a way of opening the right doors. Sandra came through one of those doors about 7 months later, at a pond, watching a bird that had no idea it was being watched. That's what I'd want anyone to take from any of this. Not a lesson with clean edges. Just the observation that how you treat people who can't do anything for you is the most accurate measure of who you are. And the people you dismiss as irrelevant have a way of turning out to be exactly the ones who mattered most. My mother knew that her whole life. She just never needed to say it out loud.